Iron Maiden's albums ranked 17-1. We're going through all of Iron Maiden's albums. I went through Iron Maiden-A-Thon, which was my track-by-track review series on all of Iron Maiden's albums, where we went through 1 to 17. We even did 2 for Senjutsu because we did our preliminary one and our final thoughts on the album. But we're going through the ranks here. If you watched all those videos, you can get sort of a feel for it. But we'll start off with an album that I get a lot of comments about to this day because of my review on it, and that is number 17 here, the worst Iron Maiden album. We've got No Prayer for the Dying, and like I said in that review, I really enjoy the first half of this album from Tail Gunner all the way to Fate's Warning, and then the second half of the album is really where the wheels fall off of this one. The production on this one is easily their weakest. It was recorded in a barn, basically, on Steve Harris's property. But this one, it is Iron Maiden's worst album, but it is the best album for, I don't know, 99% of bands out there. So you've got some pretty good solid tracks on here. My favorite track on the album is probably Tail Gunner, but you can, convince me of the title track, Holy Smoke. Anything out of that first half, basically, is really good on this one. But outside of that, this one's easily their worst. And then we'll go to number 16. We've got the second Blaze Bayley album. We've got Virtual 11. Virtual 11, they really sort of went into this direction with the X Factor before, and then they sort of pulled that back because of the reaction to that album. And so Virtual 11, we've got some pretty good tracks here still. We've got, tracks like Future Real, Lightning Strikes Twice, The Klansman, but then you've also got some sort of murkier tracks like The Angel and the Gambler, Way Too Long. There's a single version of that that's actually pretty interesting that cuts out a lot of the choruses there, but you've got some other tracks, like Don't Look Into the Eyes of a Stranger is kind of eh. I like that song. I like the solos on that song. This album is not horrible, but it's just sort of like a 79 or like a 77 or a 75 out of 100. It's not their best. It has The Klansman, which is one of their best tracks ever, but some of the other tracks could have used some work and are sort of mediocre. After that, we've got a controversial pick here because I'm sure there's some Paul Di'Anno fans out there that'll go, why is Killers this low? Killers is this low because it has a lot of filler on this album. This album is 11 tracks long, which is it's pretty long for an Iron Maiden album. You've got some classic songs on here like Wrathchild, the title track Killers, Murders in the Rue Morgue, Purgatory, but then you've got some real stinkers. You've got Another Life, Genghis Khan, Innocent Exile, Prodigal Son, Twilight Zone, which is Drifter, which is sort of underrated on this album, but you've got a lot of songs on here that are kind of just and it's Paul Di'Anno's last album. If Iron Maiden would have kept going with this style, they would not have been as big as they are, so we can be thankful that Bruce Dickinson joined the band, but Killers is simply It's about on par for me with Virtual 11. This one has more classic tracks than that album does, which it gets the nod for here. And of course, the album artwork with Eddie is one of the most iconic pieces of artwork for any heavy metal album. But this one, sadly, does not meet the mark of the previous album, Iron Maiden, from Paul Di'Anno. After that, we'll get to the last Bruce Dickinson album until the reunion era. We've got Fear of the Dark, and with my nice $4.99 for sale sticker there. And Fear of the Dark is also a really long album. It has 12 tracks. You could have cut out a lot of these and had a much better album, or cut out some of them and had a much more coherent album, but they really just put everything onto this album that they could. You've got some real classic tracks like Fear of the Dark. You've got Afraid to Shoot Strangers. The opening two tracks, Be Quick or Be Dead, or From Here to Eternity, are also really great, but you've got some sort of stinkers here. You've got Weekend Warrior, which is it's really catchy and stupid, but it's not one of their best tracks here. You've got The Fugitive, which is kind of You've got The Apparition, which is the definition of sort of Iron Maiden filler here. But then you've also got Judas Be My Guide, which is the most underrated track on the album. It should have been a single for this. If Judas Be My Guide was a single, this album might be a lot different in a lot of people's eyes. But for now, because it's the length and the tracks that are sort of on it, you get it here on the list. You've got an album that a lot of people thought was going to be their last album, but you've got The Final Frontier, which is really long and has some pretty good tracks on here. Maybe not some classic tracks, but a lot of tracks that are very, very solid. This is sort of the blueprint for this sort of trilogy of albums that we got from Iron Maiden from here, where we got The Final Frontier, The Book of Souls, and Senjutsu, where they all have some pretty lengthy songs. They've got a lot of progressive elements, and this is sort of that peak of that progressive era of Iron Maiden, or you could say Senjutsu is the peak. But Satellite 15, The Final Frontier, is a pretty damn good opening track here. And then you've got Where the Wild Wind Blows, which is When the Wild Wind Blows, pardon me, which is one of my favorite tracks here on this album, and one of my favorite tracks to hear live. I missed this tour. I saw the opening tour of it where they played The Final Frontier and then a bunch of the reunion era tracks. So I was really sad to miss this album on tour. But you've got some great tracks like The Talisman is fantastic. The Alchemist is sort of classic sounding Iron Maiden. Isle of Avalon, Coming Home, Mother of Mercy, El Dorado. So you've got a lot of very solid tracks on this one, but nothing that's super great besides When the Wild Wind Blows. So that brings us to another controversial pick here. We've got Brave New World along with a best value sticker and another sticker, so you know this is legit. A lot of people really like Brave New World. I think the love for this album has to do with where people were in their sort of Iron Maiden love in their Iron Maiden careers, because I didn't find out about this album until I started listening to Iron Maiden in around 2008, 2009, and so this was just another album for me. This wasn't the reunion, Bruce Dickinson is back. It was just another Iron Maiden album that I listened to in the line, and this one has some really great tracks, and it has some that I would consider to be lesser for Iron Maiden's standards, of course. The Wicker Man is absolutely fantastic. Ghost of the Navigator is my favorite track on the album, probably the most underrated track on the album. Blood Brothers is fantastic. Dream of Mirrors is really great. The album, you can hear some of the Blaze Bayley Iron Maiden album sort of influences on this one, and there are some tracks here that he doesn't get credit for, but he says, obviously, I was, involved in the writing of that, and the band will tell you that. But this one also has some stinkers, and Stinker is a little... When we're getting into this range of Iron Maiden albums, Stinker isn't really going to happen, but this one, it does have some tracks that I would consider to be lesser in quality compared to some other tracks. So that's where Brave New World fits. Comment if you think Brave New World's a bit higher than this or lower than this. Up next, we have what I thought would be the last Iron Maiden album. We have an album that came out at a very special time for me in my life when I was in college. We have the Book of Souls. And so this album, the fanfare was there. It was a huge release. They had this at Best Buy, tons of copies and everything like that. And it delivered. This album delivered on so many different levels. You have epic tracks. You have speedier tracks that remind you of sort of Iron Maiden's past. If Eternity Should Fail is another great opening track. Iron Maiden's really good at giving you an insane opening track. The Book of Souls, the title track, is the main event of it. It's that good. Death or Glory, another one of those sort of speedy classic tracks. The Red and the Black is probably the co-main event of this. And then you have Empire of the Clouds, which is just a whole nother experience. It's a rock opera. It's 20 minutes long. It is an epic track to end an epic album that I thought would be the last one because of Bruce Dickinson's cancer diagnosis. But we got a Book of Souls tour, and we got another album after this. But the Book of Souls is sort of that Empire Strikes Back of that trilogy of reunion albums that follow this progressive track for Iron Maiden. And this one is utterly fantastic. And if there weren't so many good albums ahead of it, this would be a part of that pantheon. But obviously, being Iron Maiden, you have so many magnificent albums coming after this. Paul Di'Anno fans can rejoice now with our next album on the list because we have Iron Maiden, the album here. And this one is sort of... It doesn't sound like the Iron Maiden that you might know or you might know and love, but Paul Di'Anno sings the crap out of this album. It's got everything you want, and it also has some sort of sprinklings of what Iron Maiden could become with Phantom of the Opera and Remember Tomorrow, with sort of that progressive sound here, but you also have that punk sort of sound that Steve Harris will deny, but it's there. We can all hear it on tracks like Prowler and Sanctuary and Running Free, and you've got the best Iron Maiden instrumental here with Transylvania, and you've got the Charlotte the Harlot saga's beginning. You've got the title track of Iron Maiden off the Iron Maiden album by Iron Maiden. So this one is utterly fantastic, but like I said before, the albums after this are just the best of the best of the beast, if you would, of Iron Maiden. This is sure to be a controversial pick, but because it's my list and not yours, we've got the X Factor coming in ahead of all those albums. The X Factor shares a special place in my heart, And you can go back and watch my review of the X Factor. I get emotional talking about this one because of everything that goes into this album. This album is just sort of a therapy session in an album, and you get Blaze Bayley's first album. You get all of the sort of Iron Maiden hope that comes with that, and then you get the darkness of this album, and this album is very dark and dreary, and if you are having a hard time out there, this one might help you out, because there's a lot of themes that are sort of personable on this album, and you've got some great tracks. You've got Sign of the Cross, which is a slam dunk classic. You've got Man on the Edge, which is speed metal sort of Iron Maiden classic. You've got Lord of the Flies, which is another solid, underrated track. It's just from top to bottom, you've got great tracks on this one. And then this one also had some insane tracks on the bonus tracks that you got on a Japanese special edition. I said I was going to do a video about that and sort of retrack this one. That one's coming. I've just been writing it and sort of getting it ready. But this one is utterly fantastic, and it's even better when you include those bonus tracks to sort of break up those longer, darker, drearier tracks on this one. But you don't want to miss the X Factor. If you haven't listened to this album because it's Blaze Bayley, give it a shot. This is sort of the genesis of that new Iron Maiden sound. You can hear it here, and Blaze Bayley sings the absolute crap out of this one. And so if you don't like Blaze Bayley, whatever, but if you do, or if you haven't listened to it, give this one a shot. It'll surprise you. Now we've got one that I know a lot of people out there like. We've got Dance of Death, which has the worst Iron Maiden album art of all time, but it has some of the best songs of this reunion era that we've got on here. We've got Dance of Death, No More Lies, Wildest Dreams, Rainmaker, Passchendaele. The sort of forgotten songs on this album are really, really strong. Montsegur is really strong. Gates of Tomorrow, New Frontier is one of the best choruses of any non-sort of single Iron Maiden album out there. Face in the Sand, Age of Innocence, and it ends with Journeyman, which is a interesting choice to end the album with, but Iron Maiden always has the best opening and closing songs on their albums, except for Mother Russia. That one sucks. But this one, really, really fantastic album from top to bottom. Sort of the reunion era, seventh son of a seventh son, if you would, but it doesn't have that sort of overarching story. But the quality of this album, they really hit their stride in the reunion era with Dance of Death and continued it all the way up to Senjutsu. Speaking of Senjutsu, I don't have the CD out because I've got the big-ass fan club box set here that I bought when the album came out. This is one of my most prized Iron Maiden possessions, so I'm going to put it down because I'm talking about Senjutsu, but I've made 2 videos about that album now, and it is just utterly fantastic. It gets better and better every time I listen to it. It has those 3 sort of epic Steve Harris tracks at the end in Death of the Celts, The Parchment, and Hell on Earth, which is in my top 10 best Iron Maiden songs ever, because Hell on Earth, it's just the culmination of just this whole era of Iron Maiden put into one song. It encapsulates sort of what we feel on planet Earth right now. We're sort of living in a hell on Earth in some ways, but it's just, it's not the best of the reunion era because there are some tracks on it that are sort of lesser, but you have great tracks in the middle, like The Time Machine. You have the opening 3 tracks in Senjutsu, Stratego, and The Writing on the Wall. It's just a total package that just barely gets beaten out by another reunion era album here. But Senjutsu, if you haven't listened to it, what are you doing? Go listen to it. It's great. It's fantastic. I can't wait to see them play it live when I see them in September, and then whenever they do the Senjutsu World Tour, it'll be great. For those classic Iron Maiden fans out there, I know this is some people's favorite of their favorites, but this is Peace of Mind coming in here. And Peace of Mind has some great songs. It's sort of the underrated Iron Maiden album, I'd call it. And some people gave me flack for that, for calling it underrated, but I think it is. I think it really is because of the tracks on the album that they play. Where Eagles Dare is a great opener. Revelations, Flight of Icarus, Die With Your Boots On, The Trooper. It goes on, and then it's sort of, you got Still Life, which is, I think, among their most underrated tracks. You don't hear a lot of people talking about Still Life because they haven't played it live since the Seventh Son tour. But you do have the last 3 tracks on the album are not my favorite, with Quest of Fire, Stun and Steel, and Tamerlan. Stun and Steel's fun, but it's sort of just single-sounding Iron Maiden sort of middle-tier stuff. And then Tamerlan, I think, is the weakest of the sort of epic ending tracks that we get to Iron Maiden albums. But nonetheless, Peace of Mind is iconic. The Trooper is iconic. It's a classic song. It's, if you know Iron Maiden, you know The Trooper. If you don't know Iron Maiden, you know The Trooper. So you get this album, you get a lot of classic tracks on it, but those last three sort of drag it down to a place here. But this whole next grouping is sort of that A-S tier of Iron Maiden albums, where it's just absolute stone cold killers, and it just depends on personal preference. After that, we have an album that does have a little bit of a weaker middle section, but it's made up by the fact that it has, you know, three or four of the most classic Iron Maiden songs of all time. And then we've got Powerslave. Top to bottom, Powerslave might kick the most ass of any Iron Maiden album. It's just like, this is the heavy metal peak of Iron Maiden here. But you have Aces High, you have 2 Minutes to Midnight, you have Powerslave and Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Rime of the Ancient Mariner combines the two worlds of like that progressive Iron Maiden with the sort of kick-ass heavy metal Iron Maiden that a lot of people want to go back to over and over again. But you've got Powerslave, which has the best Iron Maiden solo of all time. You've got Aces High, which is the best opening track of all time. And you've got 2 Minutes to Midnight, which might be one of their best singles of all time. So you've got a lot of best tracks here, but then you've also got some sort of underrated ones. Back in the Village, really underrated, sort of that heavy metal thunder of Iron Maiden. And then you've got Flash of the Blade, which was in a Dario Argento movie, Phenomena. And then you've got Lost for Words, which is sort of an instrumental, probably the weakest of the instrumentals that they've did. Also the last of the instrumentals. But Powerslave is a classic album with classic album artwork, classic iconography, and just a great album overall. This one, I don't know if it's controversial or not, but this is the best of the reunion era. We've got A Matter of Life and Death. And I don't care if you disagree with me. This is a concept album through and through. I have convinced myself of that this one, from top to bottom, is, if you listen to this album from 1 to 10, from Different World to The Legacy, you will get a story built in here about mankind and how we've sort of lost our way and we are losing our way. But it's a very prescient album. You've got Different World, These Colors Don't Run, Brighter Than the Thousand Suns, The Pilgrim, which is probably the weakest track, maybe Out of the Shadows, The Current Reincarnation of Benjamin Brieg, For the Greater Good of God, which is the underrated track on here, Lord of Light, and then the main event, which is The Legacy, which goes up there with the best of those sort of ending tracks. It tells you a story, it gets you pumped, it gets you sort of pissed off about these people that have taken advantage of the working class, the common man here. But you just get an absolute crazy album here with some great underrated album artwork and some great iconography with this Eddie sort of logo here. And this one came out at a weird time. This was just before I started listening to Iron Maiden, but I picked this one up late, and you really have to listen to this one from front to back, all the way through in one sitting. It's long. It's very long, but you will get an appreciation like no other for A Matter of Life and Death. And it is the best of the reunion era, just narrowly beating out Senjutsu. But this one is a little more coherent and has a bit more quality among each of the tracks, and isn't so, you know, peaks and valley like Senjutsu is with some of the tracks on that one. But this is an absolutely fantastic Iron Maiden album, the best of the reunion era. And then there were three. So we've got these three, which the top two are interchangeable for me, but this one is firmly in third because I love these other two albums. But in third place, we have The Number of the Beast. This is the quintessential Iron Maiden album. This is the album, besides maybe Painkiller, that I would hand to somebody if they were like, yo, what's heavy metal? I would go, here you go, my friend. Here is heavy metal. Here is Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast. It has their most classic tracks. It has Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills, Hallowed Be Thy Name, the ones you've heard a million times, that everybody gripes about, that they play all the time. But guess what? You go and see Iron Maiden for the first time. Tell me what songs you were looking forward to. If you tell me that it's not Number of the Beast, The Trooper, Hallowed Be Thy Name, Run to the Hills, you are lying. You are a liar, because they are a classic. Everybody wants to go. Those are the songs that get you into Iron Maiden. Those are the songs that grab you and that sort of introduce you to this wonderful world of heavy metal that you get from Number of the Beast. And Number of the Beast is absolutely exceptional. It is Bruce Dickinson's first album. He sings the crap out of every track on this album. And then you get some really underrated tracks. You get Total Eclipse, which obviously didn't make the original cut, but should have. You get The Prisoner and 22 Acacia Avenue that are also utterly underrated. And then you've got Children of the Damned, Invaders, and then Gangland, which is the weakest track on the album. But this one, based on those three classic tracks alone, should be up there in anybody's top 5, maybe even number 1, depending on your personal preference. But Number of the Beast is absolutely stone cold killer classic of Iron Maiden and heavy metal. Whew. So this one is a hard decision. It's really hard between these two albums for what's the top slot. This is the concept album, and it barely, just barely gets edged out by the #1 slot, but we've got Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. This is sort of like, this is the pinnacle of Iron Maiden for me. Maybe Number of the Beast might be the most popular pinnacle, but this is where these two albums are where they were at their peak musically. Bruce Dickinson's voice was at his peak. Their songwriting powers were at their peak. This one does not have a bad track on it. From Moonchild, it's the concept album, all the way down to Only the Good Die Young. And you go through the story of the Seventh Son through here. Moonchild is just such a great opening track. I remember when I first heard it, you know, I said in my review, I had to sit down. I had to actually sit down because it was so powerful to me that Moonchild was that opening track there. And you've got Infinite Dreams and The Evil That Men Do, which might be my favorite track off this album. I love that song. Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, which is that progressive sort of Iron Maiden thunder classic here. And then you've got The Prophecy, which I think I said, you know, if I'm going to make a mixtape of Iron Maiden, I'm always putting The Prophecy on there to see if people like that song, to see what people think of that song. And then you've got The Clairvoyant and Only the Good Die Young. And I love when an album begins where it ends and ends where it begins, because it goes all in a circle of that sort of poem, that rhyme, that phrase for the, you know, 7 deadly sins all the way down. So Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, truly a classic album, truly a great heavy metal album. It gets beaten out by this one. It gets beaten out by Somewhere in Time. Somewhere in Time, there's just something about the guitar synthesizers that they used on this album, and the sound of this album captures the 80s perfectly, but it also sounds like it's futuristic, it's modern. And so you get tons of great tracks on here. You've got heavy metal tracks, you've got progressive metal tracks, you've got new wave of British heavy metal tracks, you've got sort of speed sort of metal tracks, you've got those glam metal sort of ballads on here, and then you've got everything that you want in an 80s heavy metal album is on this album. Starts off with Caught Somewhere in Time. You get the taste. You get exactly what this album is about with the synthesizers. You get Wasted Years for that sort of ballad, that sort of raise your fist and scream the chorus out. You've got Sea of Madness, which just kicks your ass right from the beginning and keeps going. You've got Heaven Can Wait, which is sort of that arena rock, sort of just everyone screaming the chorus and jumping up and down and going, oh, you know, it's just amazing. You've got Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner with that progressive sort of Iron Maiden sound. You've got Stranger in a Strange Land with that single just potential there with one of the best solos they've ever done. You've got Deja Vu, which is sort of the weakest of the bunch here. And then you've got Alexander the Great, which is the track that everybody wants to hear them play live. Everybody wants to hear them play Alexander the Great live. I have no idea if they're ever going to play it live. And you've got the best Iron Maiden album artwork of all time, the best Eddie of all time in Cyborg Eddie. Fight me. What's your favorite Eddie in the comments? Let me know. But we've got Seventh Son and Somewhere in Time at the 2 top slots here because they are just my favorite Iron Maiden albums. They are the best Iron Maiden albums. They're the ones I go back to the most, the ones I've listened to the most, and the ones that sort of guide me through my life the most. But that'll do it for Iron Maiden's albums ranked 17 to 1, 1 to 17, whatever you want to do it. These are all of Iron Maiden's albums, best to worst, worst to best. And what are your favorite Iron Maiden albums? What is your order? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter at Hunter Bolding. But that'll do it for this video. That'll do it from me to you for Eddie. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe and do all that YouTube stuff because it really helps me out to know what Iron Maiden content you want to hear. And stick around on the channel in the future for Judas Priest-A-Thon. That is coming. We are doing a review of every Judas Priest album from Rock-A-Rolla all the way to Firepower, and whenever their new album comes out, we might get to that one by the time we get to Firepower. But thank you for watching, and Iron Maiden will always get you, and Eddie will always be there for you, so thank you for watching.